My name is Ashley Tabron, and I am a study skills tutor here at the ILC. I also work with the Writing Center. Typically, before COVID, I was a tutor on the North Campus, but now I am fully online and I work evenings and weekends. So if evenings and weekends are your schedule, then hopefully the stars will align and we can work together throughout the semester. Again, my name is Ashley Tabron. Today we're going to be talking about 4 skills that readers use while reading critically, and then we're going to be talking about 3 strategies that are going to help you become better readers. So without further ado, let's dive in. We're going to take a few moments to read this passage. We're going to be using it throughout our session as we go through the various skills and strategies for critical reading at the college level. So while these strategies and skills can be applicable to any class and any text, we're going to focus on a passage from A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor as we discuss these 4 skills. So I'm going to take a moment to read the passage for you, and then when we finish, I want you to tell me one detail that you remember from the passage in the chat. The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. He was sitting on the edge of his chair at the table, bent over the orange sports section of the journal. Now look here, Bailey, she said. See here, read this. And she stood with one hand on her thin hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. Here, this fellow that calls himself the Misfit is a loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida. And you read here what it says he did to these people. Just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that, a loose in it. Kerchief that had 2 points on the top like ears. She was sitting on the sofa feeding the baby apricot from a jar. The children have been to Florida before, the old lady said. You ought to take them somewhere else for a change so they would see different parts of the world and be broad. They never have been to East Tennessee. So I want you to take one more moment to look at the passage, and then I'm going to ask you for an important detail in just a second. I'm going to take the passage away for you to write a detail and just tell me anything that you remember from the passage in the chat, starting now. What is one detail that you remember? When other people start typing their responses, I want us to see if we can think of any similarities. And if there are some similarities, I want you to tell me why you think that is the case. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to tell me a detail that you remember. So Kayla says that the grandmother is trying her best to convince her son to take her to Tennessee instead of Florida. Steven says the grandmother didn't want to go/move to Florida. Albany says they are going to Florida. Bailey is the one child that the grandmother lived with. The boy in the chair is her only son. These are all great and different details. I see some other people are typing, so I'm going to continue to give you a moment. But some commonalities that I'm noticing are that everyone is mentioning the grandmother, everyone is mentioning they're going somewhere, and people are mentioning the places that they're going, which is Florida and Tennessee. A few of you mentioned the boy, and some of you called him by name. The passage was supposed to come up on the screen, Aaron, but we are going to revisit the passage throughout the first part of the session, so you'll have another opportunity to look at it again. So we're going to use this passage to guide our way through the key skills that you need to learn to be a good critical reader. But first, we need to talk about why learn about critical reading strategies. So before we can dive into those strategies, we first need to discuss why it's important for you to be a critical reader, especially with us being online for the majority of the past year. You may have noticed that you have read a passage before and immediately forgot what you have read. If that is you, you can simply raise your hand or do one of the reactions if that resonates. I know that I have done that recently, read a passage to try to understand it and walked away from it and couldn't really remember what was said. So it's important for you to use these critical reading strategies that we're going to go over in order for you to better understand and retain information that you read. So before I give you my definition of critical reading and those components, I would like for you to tell me in about 6 words. I think only 6 words is important because it really allows you to get to the meaning of what you're trying to say. I want you to tell me what you think critical reading is. I'm going to give you a little hint. When reading critically, you are not only reading to remember, but you are also reading to learn. So if you could tell me what you think critical reading is in about 6 words in the chat. Aaron says it's the ability to comprehend the text. That's a great example. Stephen says critical reading involves analyzing and stamina. Stephen, that is a very good definition, especially the stamina when you have to read a sustained passage for a long amount of time. You have to stay focused in order to retain it. That's good. Dana, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, said focusing on the main idea of the passage. That is a key component that we're going to bring up as well. Those are great definitions, you all. Fatima says analysis of the content of the text. I like that, Fatima. And Crystal says understanding what you read. I think a lot of you have different definitions, but they are all key components of what it means to read critically. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what those 4 skills are. So the first main component of critical reading is analysis. When you're reading and analyzing a text, a critical reader breaks down each part of the text. Like in our example, we might look at the plot, we might look at the setting, we might look at the conflict, and we have to understand how each part works to contribute to a whole. Analysis is the first critical step, and then we have synthesis. Synthesis is the process of making connections between 2 or more concepts and ideas and exploring that connection and relationship. So after you analyze and after you synthesize, then your professors will be asking you to interpret. When you are interpreting something, you put 2 and 2 together to make meaning. And that could be 2 ideas in the text, that can be 2 paragraphs, 2 lines from a poem, or 2 essays, or 2 themes, and making meaning from that. And finally, when you are a critical reader, you have to evaluate, which is the act of assigning value to a text or component and applying the 3 previous things that we learned about. So we're going to start with the first main skill of critical reading, which is analysis. So analysis is the first essential step of critical reading. When you are analyzing, you are separating details to discover how they all contribute to the main idea of a text. I'll use a movie or a reality television show as an example. So let's say you're watching a breakup scene in a movie and you feel sympathy for the characters. Well, what allows you to feel that way? You may notice that there's swelling music in the background. You may resonate with some of the dialogue that the actors say. You may be looking at the editing of zooming in on the protagonist's face when she's crying. And you can break down each of those parts and reflect on how they all contribute to the effectiveness of the emotion of the scene that really tugged at your heartstrings and made you feel something. The same thing can be done with reading as well. It just involves a little bit more imagination. As a reader, you could ask some questions to analyze, like, how might this be different with a different set of characters or even a different setting? If you're reading a scary story and it's set at night, that helps contribute to the mood. That could be completely different if you're reading a story that's set in the daytime. So remember, when you're analyzing, you're gathering evidence. It's going to help you develop your personal opinion, but your opinion has to be well informed. So analysis is separating important details, using your imagination, and then creating a personal opinion based on that result. So we're actually going to return back to our passage from A Good Man is Hard to Find and do some more analysis. So sometimes I flip back and forth because I have to have a monitor next to my laptop because I can't read anymore on a small screen because I'm old. So it looks like I'm not looking at the camera, but I'm looking at my other monitor. I just wanted to tell you that. So again, this is the passage that we just read before, and I want to know who you think is the main character from the passage. So I'll read a little bit of it again while you can only see me. Can you not see my screen? Well, I see some answers already. Can everyone see my presentation? Okay. I'm sorry, Aaron, if you can't. Let me see while you're doing the next activity. I'll try to see if I can put this presentation in the chat from you. Okay. So a lot of people are telling me that they think the main character is the grandmother. I see the grandmother twice. Um, does anybody think the main character is someone else? So if we're analyzing the text to figure out who the main character is, can someone provide for me in the chat why they think the grandmother is the main character? Fatima says she thinks the grandmother is the main character. She's referred to Bailey a lot, but it's not Bailey. So Fatima thinks that the story is focused on her, as well as Kayla. And Stephen also rightfully pointed out that the grandmother is what the text starts with. So all of those different clues or pieces of the text would lead you to make an analysis that the grandmother is the main character. Good job. So the next component of reading critically is synthesis. Synthesis is the next main component of critical reading, and it is the art of connecting two important ideas. Most of us already have experience with synthesis if you've ever used the skill of comparing and contrasting. So just as you might focus on the differences between the grandmother and Bailey in our sample passage, you also might make connections between our government and the government of ancient Rome, or the difference between organelles in an animal cell or a plant cell. So comparison and contrasting is a good way for you to practice the skill of synthesis. Once you compare and contrast, the second key component of synthesis is connection. So your instructor may ask you to connect two stories or essays or even concepts that you are learning that are outside the subject of your class. You'll need to go from naming a specific concrete difference, like the surface level details in our initial analysis of who was the main character, to abstract connections, which require a greater amount of heavy lifting from you as a critical reader. So we're going to go back to our passage again. And this is actually going back and returning to a text multiple times is a strategy that promotes critical reading. So let's go back to our passage and answer this question. If the story were told from Bailey's point of view, what might the first sentence be? So I would like for you to write what you think the first sentence would be if it was told from the perspective of Bailey. The old lady in the last two sentences is that the grandmother. I think that is an inference that you can make. You are definitely doing some synthesis. I think it's a little bit confusing at first, and I chose it on purpose because I think it's a text that is easy to follow, but has a little bit of layers. But hopefully, by the time we return to it the fourth time, I think you'll walk away with a better understanding, and perhaps you'll even want to read it. So Kayla says it would most likely be how the plans to take his family to Florida, but the mother wants to take him to Tennessee. So Kayla thinks if the story were told from a different perspective, we might talk about how Bailey wants to go to Florida. I think that's a great example, Kayla. Crystal's first line is that Bailey's grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. That's a good first line, Crystal. She simply changed the beginning just a little bit, and that's some synthesis there, making meaning from an original text. Stephen says it says in the last sentence, which means the grandmother and her grandson, which means that the grandson is Bailey, who the last sentence refers to. Stephen is also doing some really important meaning making. So again, synthesis is the act of making connections and comparing and contrasting, which is kind of what we've been doing as we looked at the different perspectives of Bailey and the grandmother. So some of you have already stretched to this when discussing in the chat, but the third main component of being a good critical reader is interpretation. So interpretation is really trying to figure out what a passage means. Think of yourself as a detective when you're reading a passage. How does the author's word choice, examples, and even pictures lead you to a conclusion? Beyond visual cues and diagrams, how does the author's tone show up in the writing as well? Is the author being serious, funny, or perhaps even a bit skeptical? Your goal with interpretation is to read between the lines to support your understanding of tone or mood, in this particular example, to support your original point of view on the text and subject matter. However, no matter if you are reading a psychology text or a biology one, interpretation is an important part of critical reading. Once again, we're going to look at our passage from A Good Man is Hard to Find. Kayla has a good point that I want to bring up. Bailey is her son, but why is she referred to as a grandmother? I think that's because Bailey has children. So I was hoping that someone would bring up when we were talking about who the focal character is that Bailey is a named character and the grandmother is not. So that could have some meaning. Bailey could be a more important character if he is named and the grandmother isn't. So I thought that was an interesting concept, but I'm glad that Kayla asked that clarifying question in the chat. One good thing about being a critical reader is to pick up on those details and ask clarifying questions. So that was a very astute observation, Kayla. I would like for you to tell me to interpret what we've read and give me a character flaw or weakness from either Bailey or the grandmother. Yeah, the grandmother is referring to Bailey's kids. What do you think is one flaw that the grandmother has or one flaw that Bailey has? Let's interpret the text a little bit. I'll wait for a moment for some responses. Yes. What is a flaw or something that you think is a weakness of their character? For example, Kayla says that she tries to use her grandkids to get what she wants. I definitely think she uses that emotional appeal to try to persuade them to reconsider going to Florida. Erin says a weakness of the grandmother is that she is dead set on going to Tennessee. And I also see that Bailey was not very respectful. I think that way too. He's not really paying attention to his mother. He's not really listening to what she's saying. He's kind of ignoring her. I agree. That's good. So we see how we have very little information about the characters or about the setting or even where the story is going, but we still can interpret and make meaning from what we do have on our screens. Kayla says they are both stubborn. And so then Kayla's doing some analysis, she's doing some synthesizing and some interpretation in that statement alone because she has to look at multiple aspects of the story to make that conclusion. Very good. Stephen said the grandmother's too worried about what could happen since a prisoner escaped. And Crystal says the grandmother isn't standing up for what she wants, and Bailey isn't showing his mother respect. So see how we all are reading this one text and coming up with these different interpretations, which are all true and valid. And one way to make sure that the interpretation is true and valid is to evaluate the specific evidence that we're using. Her approach is pretty lame. It's so obvious. Yeah, I think that's funny, and I think that's probably why the characters aren't really taking that too much into consideration when making that choice. That was a funny observation. So, the last step in being a critical reader, and then we're going to talk about specific strategies. The last skill is using the tool of evaluation. So, let's say you're being asked to write an essay on point of view, and a good man is hard to find because we have spent some time in this presentation looking at Bailey's point of view and looking at the grandmother's point of view about the upcoming trip. Your instructor will want your original takes and ideas, but they might also ask you to consult experts in the field for support. So when you conduct your research, which is the first component of evaluation, it is important to use the previous components of analysis, synthesis, and interpretation to evaluate which source is the best fit to answer your research question. When evaluating, that is a great question, Kayla. And I think if you are interested in the story, I'm going to put the link in the chat at the end so you can find that out. But that's a good question. When evaluating, we have to ask, is this the best source? If you're quoting from the text for our discussion board post, which is something that I see frequently as an assignment as I tutor in the ILC, you might want to evaluate if the text evidence is the best one to support your claim. When you carefully evaluate, it leads to a better understanding of what you read and a better chance for you to apply your reading to the next step in the process, like writing an essay or contributing to a class discussion. Yes, B, I don't think you can unmute, but feel free to ask your question in the chat, and I'm going to try to answer it as we go forth. But I don't think you can unmute. I missed this comment. I didn't think the grandmother was truly worried about the criminal. She used that to provoke the worries in the parents in order to not go to Florida. That is a good statement, and that is some evaluation and some synthesis there. You guys are really hitting it out the park with these concepts and skills. So I know that everybody's really enjoying this story. This is our final time we're going to revisit it to answer this last question about evaluation. I want you to choose one sentence from the story that you particularly liked and discuss only that sentence. Tell me why you think it is the most important. I don't think I can unmute you. Let's see if I can. I don't think so. I can. Would you like to speak, B? Get it, allow. So, I don't know. I think I clicked allow mic if you have a question. Not really sure. But which sentence do we think is the most important sentence and why we liked it? So for example, I think the grandmother didn't want to go to Florida is the most important sentence. And I think that is the most important sentence because it immediately provides me with context for a conflict. Kayla said Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. And Kayla said that is the most important sentence because it shows that the grandmother only has her son to rely on, which is why she must go to him, through him, to get to Tennessee. Makiba and I picked the same sentence. The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. The story is wrapped around her trying to persuade Bailey and his wife. Erin said the most important sentence is she wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. It shows that she is selfish, which is an interpretation. Good job. Wanting to visit her friends, her seizing at every chance also shows her stubbornness and a chance for conflict. Ooh, I like that, especially the conflict, because that's what's going to keep the story interesting and engaging moving forward. Dana picked the same one I did. Bailey's grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. And then Makiba said opinion. Interesting. So we have now discussed the four main components of being a critical reader: interpretation, evaluation, synthesis, and analysis. I'm going to give you a moment if you have any questions about any 4 of those skills or anything else about this passage to type that in now before we shift to the next components, which are some foolproof strategies to help you increase your reading skills, your critical reading skills. Dana says the entire passage was revolving around her wish to go to Tennessee. The story takes an interesting turn, you guys, so I'm excited. If you would like to read the story further, I'm definitely going to put that in the chat at the end, because I think you would be interested to see where it goes next. Fatima added, you ought to take them somewhere else for a change so they would see different parts of the world and be broad. I think the sentence shows she didn't want to go to Florida and persuaded them in a way to be open-minded despite the grandmother being stubborn. Ooh, to go to Tennessee. Fatima, that's great because she wants them to be open-minded while she's closed-minded. You hit on that paradox there, that contrast. That's really interesting. Charlene said, ooh, I like this, classic manipulation between the grandmother and Bailey. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did. Oh, yeah, that is some manipulation. And if anybody's good at that, I definitely think it's parents when they want you to do something. Kayla also said the same sentence. So we know that that one is important and it's active irony because both the grandmother and Bailey are at their own wants, are after their own wants, which is a selfish act and against a person's conscience. Ooh, that's some really good interpretation, you guys. Makeba, I would be happy to put the whole story in the chat at the end of the presentation. I think you guys will really like it. And then the last comment I see is, I like the first half sentence of the second paragraph. It depicts a second relationship between the grandma and the son and daughter-in-law. So I want us to notice before we shift to the next part of our presentation. Okay, thank you. I didn't want to mess it up, Shishi. So thank you for saying that in the chat, because I do want to call you by your name, but I did want to pronounce it correctly. I want to say that we've only been looking at 2 paragraphs for about 20 minutes or so, but see how much we've been able to have a good discussion in the chat and how much enhanced that discussion would be if we were in person or having the ability to talk when we're unmuted. So I really want you to know that critical reading is such a skill to enhance our understanding of a text. So many of you are wishing to read the story. So many of you are walking away with interesting claims, and it really is spending multiple opportunities to revisit the text and looking at it from different lenses. So I'm glad that everyone has been doing that so far. Awesome. And like I said, I work in the Writing and Study Skills Center, and we can sit and do this with you all too. I think a lot of students meet with us and think that we only meet for essays, which we do, but I would love to sit and read a text with a student and really break down some of the parts as well. So just know that we are open to doing that with you in the ILC if you're enjoying this, and we can do that in a one-on-one session as well. The last comment for this story is Bailey didn't pay attention, which doesn't mean he's selfish and didn't want to go. Everyone has heard the anecdote about the teacher reading blues. Oh, yeah. About the teacher reading blue curtains, meaning depression. The author just saying it means blue, right? So how do we figure out when we have started overanalyzing? Aaron, that is a great point. I would honestly say that it is a fine balance between analyzing and overanalyzing, but I think the way I know when I've gotten the most I can get out of a text is when I consider, like, am I saying the same thing over and over again? Am I only looking at the same part of the story or the same piece of evidence over and over? And once I feel like I've kind of said everything that needs to be said about a particular subject, I move forward. But there definitely is a fine line there that you pointed out. Thank you, Shishi. At one point, will the ILC have physical hourly group sessions? I think that we can schedule workshops. Like I said, I work in the writing center and the virtual portion, but we do have ILC centers. That's just kind of redundant on every campus. So I think we can definitely get you tapped into a workshop with multiple people if you are interested. These are great questions. So we talked about the skills, and now we're going to talk about 3 strategies or steps that are going to help you be a better critical reader on your own. Sorry, I got a little tongue-tied there. So just like a favorite song or a TV show, you will have to revisit a text multiple times to become a better critical reader. For example, I really like the television show The Good Place, and I've watched every episode probably 3 times if I'm being honest. And each time I watch a new episode, there are details that I find that I didn't see before. So the same is true for reading a text. For this next session of our lesson, well, I teach, so I said lesson. For this next session of our presentation, we're going to walk through how conducting a quick glance, a word for word, and a close and slow reading are essential components of your critical reading process. We've already been using these strategies by returning to the same passage throughout the first half of our presentation, but now let's see if you can do that on your own, and we're going to look at some different types of text this semester. No. So that's a good comment, Makiba. I have to read stuff multiple times, and I think the more you read and slow down and do different types of readings for each time, I think you kind of gain a better understanding of what you've read. That's a really great question, though, or comment. No, you should read a text multiple times. So a quick glance is important for us to understand and reading. And so before reading an essay or a chapter, you should conduct a quick glance of the title, the chapter headings, illustrations, and link to determine your expectations before you read it. It's also a good idea to preview any summaries that are at the end of a chapter and any statements that can help you guide your reading to fit its purpose. We're going to actually look at a U.S. history textbook to explore these components of a text. This is similar to watching a preview of an upcoming episode or a preview of a season on Netflix. So you kind of want to know where you're going before you get there, and that's what you do when you have a quick reading. No, Erin, see, I'm really glad that you guys are all saying this because it means that you are using some of the critical reading strategies already. So let's see if I can right click and open the link. I don't know. You guys can still only see my presentation, correct? So I think I have to stop presenting. Okay, let me stop presenting. And then I hate that I'm that teacher or presenter that talks through everything out loud. I'm sorry about that. But I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it's the right screen. Yes. Now can you see, oops, wrong screen. Let's see, I just pull over here. Can you see the text that I'm looking at now? I can't see actually. If people are saying yes. No. Okay, good. Let me move this over here. Okay, so we're looking at this U.S. history textbook. I found some text online, but obviously your texts are going to look a little different. But we're looking at this U.S. history textbook, and we're looking at, for example, chapter 3, which is creating new social orders. I would look at the introduction and look at the pictures. There's a chapter outline, so you can kind of see where things are headed. And you can also look at key terms, which you kind of can look at the preview. Okay, these are the things that I should be paying attention to as I read. You can look at the summaries for each section so you kind of know where you're going to go. And they also have review questions, which if you went to the earlier presentation on critical thinking, you learned a little bit about some of the review questions are just lower level to make sure you retain the information. And then they also have critical thinking strategies that are going to ask you to stretch and do some of the analysis and other things that we mentioned. So oh my gosh. I'm going to go to the next component. I have to get back to the screen. Sorry. I think it's here. Okay. There you go. Okay. So I'm going to stop presenting again. Okay. Sorry, it's a little clunky trying to figure this out. I'm going to resume. Okay. So that's what you do when you are doing a quick glance of a text. The next thing is that you're going to do is a word for word reading. So your word for word reading allows you to fill in some of the gaps or details that are missing from when you just did a quick glance. Think of this strategy as a fun way to discover important ideas about a text. When you're doing a word for word reading, you're not stopping to do anything other than just read the text. You will have some questions as you flex those critical thinking skills from our previous slides. That glance seemed like a lot, LOL. I tried to find, it was really hard for me to find a textbook online, but I did want to give examples other than just reading a passage from an English course. But that quick glance is a lot. But yes, those are the things I look for: the pictures, the titles, the summaries, and the questions. And then I would go back and do a word for word reading. We're going to look at a text from a psychology text and write a quick summary statement on motivation in the chat. So let's see if I stop presenting and then let's see if I did that right. Yes. Okay. So this is the psychology text on motivation that I wanted us to read. So again, I would still start with my quick read or quick glance and look at the learning objectives. But this is the passage that I want us to read word for word and try to write a summary statement. Why do we do the things we do? What motivations underlie our behaviors? Motivations describes the wants or needs that direct behavior toward a goal. In addition to biological motives, motivations can be intrinsic, arising from internal factors, or extrinsic, arising from external factors. Intrinsically motivated behaviors are performed because of the sense of personal satisfaction they bring, while extrinsically motivated behaviors are performed in order to receive something from others. And then we have a diagram where we see a person and we see intrinsic motivation in parentheses from within. We have autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And then we see extrinsic motivation from outside, and we see compensation, punishment, and reward. So based on our understanding of extrinsic and intrinsic and motivation in general, what would we say that passage was mostly about in the chat? No, Crystal, when I read word for word, at first I don't take notes along the way. That's what I do on the third reading and the next step when we do a close reading. Does anybody remember anything about motivation from that word for word reading that they want to let us know in the chat before we go to our last step? I have about 5 minutes left. I want to make sure I'm mindful of the time. Motivation can come from different sources. Kayla said the text talked about different types of accomplishments one could receive from motivation. Those are both true statements. I'm going to gear up my presentation one last time. Crystal noticed mainly the intrinsic motivation, and Akiba walked away with the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And Stephen was making meaning from the passage. He thought about personal and past experiences having an impact on motivation. Those are all very true statements. So we did a quick glance, we did a word for word, and our final critical reading strategy is reading closely and slowly. The third and final step to reading critically is a close, deliberate reading of a text. During a close reading, you are annotating a text by taking notes, like you mentioned, in the margin, and that is a good way to combine all of your critical reading skills. You ask questions about lines and concepts that are in the text that are unfamiliar to you, and you look up those unfamiliar words if they aren't defined clearly for you. Finally, after reading a passage multiple times in this way, you are able to make a judgment about your reading after following these steps. We're going to look at one final passage about organizational behavior, which is a concept that I didn't have that much experience or familiarity with before finding it for this activity. And I want you to take an annotation or ask or answer a question about the passage. I think I'm getting better at switching presentations. Okay. And then this is the one on organizational behavior. I don't know if you need me to zoom. I just thought about that. It's not that big. But I want us to read this line here. How do you recognize and meet the challenges facing managers in the new millennium? It has often been said that the only constant in life is change, and nowhere is this truer than in the workplace. As one recent study concluded, the United States is a competitive location to the extent that firms operating in the U.S. are able to compete successfully in the global economy while supporting high and rising living standards for the average American. Although the U.S. retains profound competitive strengths, for instance, in higher education and entrepreneurship, those strengths are increasingly threatened by weaknesses in areas such as the tax code, basic education, macroeconomic policies, and regulations. Companies face a variety of changes and challenges that will have a profound impact on organizational dynamics and performance. In fact, in many of these ways, these changes and challenges will determine who will survive and prosper into the next century and who will not. Among these challenges are the following. And we're not going to go through all of those challenges, but I want you to ask a question or define an unknown word or phrase or make meaning by writing a summary statement on this particular passage. I, for example, did not know what macroeconomic meant for this example, so I would look up macroeconomic policies, and when I search with Google, I think I did it wrong. I find out that macroeconomics is a part of economics concerned with large-scale or general economic factors such as interest rates and national productivity. Now that will help me better understand the passage that I'm reading. Does anyone have anything they learned from reading this passage on macroeconomic and the changing workplace? It's our last little statement. Something that you learned, a question that you have. I tried to, again, choose text from a variety of text and disciplines that you might encounter as you are going through your experience here at Wake Tech. So you might ask, how has the U.S. faced these challenges? Aaron said that the textbooks believe that the U.S. is raising living standards. I think that's an interesting concept, Aaron, that you hit on there. The workplace is constantly changing, which is why people may find it challenging. And we all know from the past 18 months that we've been experiencing that, or however long the pandemic's been, because honestly, I haven't been keeping count, that the workplace has drastically changed in the past year or so due to the new challenges that we as a society are facing. So that's a very good point. But thank you for doing the close reading there, returning back to the text, answering important questions, and making interpretations. That's exactly what I wanted you all to do. I hope that the session has been helpful for you today. I've really enjoyed talking with you all and listening to your interpretations of the text. And like I said, we at the ILC help you with not just writing, but reading as well. And so I hope these critical reading strategies are things that you can use as you approach any class that you're taking next semester, but especially if you're taking an English course and you would like help with that, please reach out to us. I think she said inflation is definitely something that they brought up in the text as well. And I can put I'm not going to forget to put the story in the chat, but Crystal noticed that the weaknesses in areas such as the tax code, and that she noticed that she's not very familiar with it herself, She also enjoyed this course. Thank you. If you don't mind, on your way out the door, would you please either give me 3 things that you've learned? Yes, Shishi, I'm pulling it up right now. 3 things that you learned from this workshop. Any questions, 2 questions that you still have, or something that you enjoyed. And I'm going to put the story in the chat for you. Albany says it's very important to look for small details in passages. I think that is a great statement to have. I'm trying to make it a nice hyperlink, but it's not letting me, so I'm just going to dump it in there. Makiba said that rereading is something that she's going to walk away with, remembering from the session. Stephen enjoyed how we discussed critical aspects of reading by making inferences. Makiba talked about annotating, and again, any strategy that we talked about today, we can definitely help you practice with on a smaller scale by making an individual appointment with the ILC, either in person or online. Thank you, Aaron. He enjoyed the presentation and interaction. I'm very glad that you did. It's hard to stay focused and engaged online sometimes, especially in your second or third session. So I appreciate how much you all were responsive and engaged. It definitely made it go well for me, and I want to work with all of you in the future. Kayla learned about the main skills of critical reading, the 3 steps, and rereading passages is very clarifying. Denise learned interpretation between fine lines and tone. And Dana liked the chance to analyze the passages. And then Madison liked those passages and helped her understand more. Awesome. Thank you, Fatima. She liked the organization of the information. And Crystal learned about reading 3 times. This is awesome. And I'm glad that it will be helpful for you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lindsay. And again, if you would like to follow up with us at the ILC, you can go